Kia ora koutou. Good evening, everybody. My name is Nicola Batossi. I'm General Manager at MS Auckland, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's webinar, MS and Brain Health. Our mission at MS Auckland is connecting today and inspiring tomorrow. I think tonight's session is a really good example of that. We're connecting you via wonderful presenter tonight with all the latest information to help you navigate your journey, and hopefully with some positivity and hope going forward as well with that inspiration. So tonight's session will be recorded. Brett will welcome your questions either throughout his talk, or you can save them at the end. So he'll just choose when to answer the questions. So thank you for taking the time out of your evening to join tonight's talk. MS Auckland is really pleased to provide these free of charge webinars every month. I do ask that if you've enjoyed the session and got something out of it, that you might consider a koha or a small donation to MS Auckland or to your local society if you're from outside of Auckland. All right, without further ado, tonight we are joined by Brett Drummond, who will be well known to many of you. Brett is a researcher by trade, and he is co-founder of MS Translate, based in Australia. So MS Translate forges the gap between all of the research that's going on with multiple sclerosis and the people that it's for, the people who are affected. So the work that Brett's been doing for many years and his team is being internationally recognised now. You would have seen him with his podcast from the ECTRIMS International Research Conference and so forth. So we're delighted to work with Brett and to invite him back for his second webinar with us. He's even flown across the ditch to speak in Auckland before. Brett, we're really looking forward to hearing about how to protect your cognition with MS. Also co-hosting with me tonight is Luminita Apostle. Luminita is our Senior Community Advisor at MS Auckland. Yeah, so thank you so much, Brett and Luminita, and I will hand over to you now.
Thanks, Nicola, and thanks everyone for joining. I understand it's a little later in the evening for you in New Zealand than it is here for me in Australia. So thanks, as Nicola said, thanks for giving up your time to listen to me talk tonight. I'm just going to share through my slides, which hopefully you can all see. As Nicola said, happy to take questions throughout. So if you have questions as I'm going through the presentation related to the stuff on the slides, feel free to post them through. I might not easily see them, so I might ask if Nicola or Luminita, if you see a question come up, feel free to just unmute and stop me at any time to ask that question. I've made sure also that there's plenty of time at the end for some general MS research Q&A as well. So as Nicola said, the main topic today, or sort of the broad umbrella topic that I'm going to be talking about is brain health. And we'll go through that and look at a number of different aspects of it. But before I get into that, understanding that although as Nicola said, I've been to Auckland before to talk on one of the MS research days, and I've done a webinar before, and some of you may already follow MS Translate. I just wanted to do a really quick introduction in terms of who I am and who MS Translate is, just so you have an idea as to why I am talking to you tonight. So as Nicola said again, my background is in MS research. I did MS research for many, many years, but I also have a background in science communication. And so 12, almost 13 years ago now, in partnership with my brother Eric, whose background is in social media strategy, we launched a platform called MS Translate. And so this was really off the back of seeing that there was this massive gap between people who do the research and the people who are directly impacted by the research, in this case, people living with MS, and also having an understanding that often when research is communicated, especially online, it's not always completely accurate. And so we thought it was really important that we had a researcher who understands the science, but also who has the science communication ability to be able to communicate that research in a way that's easily accessible, easy to understand, but stays accurate. No links here. We're not on TikTok, but if you want to find MS Translate on any other social media platform, you can easily find us just by typing in MS Translate, capital MS, lowercase translate, and you should find us pretty easily, but can easily send through links for anyone that's interested as well. So going from what is MS Translate and who we are, I guess the next big question to talk about before we really get into some of the specifics is what is brain health and what are we actually talking about here? And I think what's really interesting is that we use this term a lot, but no one really knows what it means. And so you don't need to worry about all of the details on the right-hand side of the screen here. But this was a publication that was published early last year, actually by a couple of researchers from Australia talking about brain health in multiple sclerosis. And the reason that they did this study was having an understanding that while we are talking more and more about brain health, what people are talking about when they use that term is actually really varied. And so they went through and they did a review of all of the literature that had been published on this. They found that there were a number of publications around it, so around 70 different papers. About half of those papers, 57%, actually gave a definition of brain health in them. But that definition varied a lot. And so some talked about it in terms of neurological reserve, brain reserve, how to preserve brain function, but others, were using different definitions. So I think when we talk about it, I'm going to give a bit of an insight into what I mean by it, but really what we're talking about is how do we keep the brain healthy and working better for longer in people living with MS. So I go from that to this really complicated graphic, and this is going to come up later, and I'm going to explain it more later. But this is sort of a very general graphic of what we might see across a number of different features in a person living with MS. And the only thing I really want you to focus on at the moment, and hopefully you can also my cursor, is this green line here. And this is brain volume, so essentially the size of the brain. Now, in every person, as we age, our brain gets smaller, our brain shrinks. That's a natural part of aging. But what we know is that in people living with MS, that process is accelerated. And so we can see sort of, if we assume this is diagnosis over here, as a person's gone through many relapses, potentially shifted to progressive MS, that brain volume drops. And so one of the things that we're talking about in terms of being able to maintain cognitive abilities and cognitive reserve and brain health is how do we get that process to not happen as quickly? Can we, in a way, make that brain volume loss back to the normal process of aging? And so really through the talk, I'm just going to be going through a number of different ways that we know can impact on brain health. And so first and foremost, the best way that we know to do that is through disease-modifying therapies or DMTs. And so over the last decade, we've obviously seen a bit of an explosion in terms of the numbers of therapies that are available. and they've all sort of increased in terms of their effectiveness. We now have a number of therapies that we would call high efficacy therapies, more powerful therapies than the ones that we would have had 10, 15, 20 years ago. We also know a lot more about the use of these therapies in people living with MS. And so that's sort of constructed here in our pyramid on the right in terms of what do we know is going to lead to the best long-term outcomes. One of the key pillars of this is early diagnosis. We know that often there is a delay in people getting diagnosed with MS, and there are a number of reasons for that. And one of the big things around diagnosis is that this year we should see the release of new criteria for the diagnosis of MS. And in terms of early discussions around that we've had recently at conferences, the idea is that it should make the diagnosis of MS simpler and line up more with what neurologists see in the clinic. So often they talk about instances where, they may be quite confident that a person might have MS, they have all of the signs of MS, but it doesn't necessarily match all of those criteria that's needed at the moment, whereas those new criteria should make it easier to get through that process. We're also learning a lot more things around the MS prodrome. And if you've heard me on previous webinars, I would have talked about this before. But this is essentially a series of things that we know happen in people living with MS before they're diagnosed and even before the onset of symptoms. So we know that before the onset of those MS symptoms, people living with MS are more likely to go to hospital, they're more likely to go to GPs, they're more likely to have headaches, more likely to have pain, more likely to see a psychologist and be dealing with mental health issues. So there's a number of health impacts that are happening before the onset of those MS symptoms. And the hope or the idea is that an understanding of this may also lead to earlier diagnosis. The reason why that's important is the earlier we can diagnose, the earlier we can get on treatment. And so that's obviously the second part of the pyramid here. And research, especially over the past 5 years, has shown quite conclusively now that the earlier we can get a person on a highly effective therapy that works for them, the better their long-term outcomes. So it wasn't that long ago that at conferences there was a debate around should a person be started on a lower efficacy therapy that comes with less side effects, and it's only once they then fail that should we escalate up and start to give them stronger and stronger drugs as needed, called escalation therapy. The name sort of speaks for itself. Or should we go the other way and should we start them on a drug that we think has the best chance of success and the best chance of stopping the disease in its tracks? Obviously comes with a few more side effects. The stronger the drug, the more side effects there are. But, also if they fail that, what are our options? And so that was sort of the debate around that. But research now has really clearly shown the earlier a person gets on a high efficacy therapy, the better their long-term outcomes in terms of disability progression. So again, the earlier we can diagnose, the earlier we can get on that effective treatment. And then the third pillar of this is how do we effectively monitor? Because if a person is on a treatment and that treatment stops working, we need to know about that as soon as possible so that that person can then switch to another therapy and not have a period of time where they're not getting the benefits out of their DMT. So effective monitoring uses things like MRI scans, but there's a lot of research being done now on things called biomarkers. So the ideal biomarker here is something that would appear in a blood test. And so you may or may not have heard of a thing called serum neurofilament light chain, a nice long word, but essentially this is something that when nerves get damaged, gets released into the bloodstream and you can measure that. And so this is one thing that researchers are looking into to see whether this is something that could be an effective and accurate thing to measure in the clinic, where a person can go in, get a blood test, look at the levels of those, with the idea that as a treatment stopped working, you would see the levels of those go up in the blood. There are other ones that are being looked at that may or may not be more accurate. So these are the three really important parts of disease-modifying therapies. Now, it should be said at this point that most of our therapies that we have at the moment all work in a similar way in terms of their targeting inflammation. And so I think I showed this graphic in the last webinar, but I'm just going to go back to it again because it brings up an important concept and brings up something new in the DMT space. So when I started in MS research back in 2005, 20 years ago now, that's making me feel old. This was a graphic that we would see all of the time, where on the left-hand side of the graphic, you can see this is the general concept of what happens when a person gets diagnosed with relapsing remitting MS. We have an initial attack here, worsening of neurological function. That attack eases off, they go in a period of remission, and then things will tend to get better. Then they'll go into remission for a while, things will stabilize, and then they may have more attacks. Each time there's attack, things tend to get a little bit worse. They don't come back to where they were. And then what we assumed happened over time, and back when I was starting, it was around about 50% of people within the first 10 years would go into a progressive phase of the disease. Really pleasingly can say now that with the effective therapies we have, that's nowhere near the number anymore, and a lot of people won't necessarily progress to secondary progressive MS in their lifetime. But what we see in the progressive forms of the disease, in secondary progressive or primary progressive, is that we have this shift here where we then go into a progressive phase where things just get worse, worse and worse. Now this, for some people, the curve can be quite steep. For other people, not so much. But the idea here is that we've shifted from inflammation being the key driver in this phase with the relapses through to more neurodegeneration. Important to say that in people with progressive MS, they can still have relapses. And what we've found more recently is that the existing therapies that are targeted towards relapsing or remitting can still be effective in people with progressive MS if they still have relapses, if there is still inflammation there that can be targeted. And that was really important because it used to be that we would stop therapy once a person progressed, but now we know that there can still be benefits from that. So the idea here is that it's a completely different thing that we need to target, this neurodegeneration. And up until very recently, that's something that we haven't been able to address at all with any of our therapies. This graphic now is not how we understand things, and this has been a real shift over the past few years. And it's due to this thing that we call smoldering MS, is a term that you may have heard, or PIRA. And PIRA stands for Progression Independent of Relapse Activities. Basically what you can see here, you've got progression happening, but there's no relapse. But going back to that graphic that I showed right at the start, this is closer to now what we would suggest is going on in MS. So you can see here in the purple line, we've got disability going on. This is inflammation. You've got relapses that you can see happening here. But importantly, what I want you to focus on this very confusing graphic is this blue line here, this neurodegeneration. So remember, in the previous graphic, we didn't see a blue line until about this part of the disease when progressive MS kicked in. What we now know is that neurodegeneration is there from the very start of the disease. So in people with relapsing remitting MS, they still have this neurodegenerative component there, this PIRA component. So without relapses, you still have worsening disability. We never really understood why that was, but now we know it's because this neurodegeneration is happening from the start. Now, as I said, this was something that we couldn't target, but as of about 6 months ago, at ECTRIMS 2024, the results of a clinical trial of a drug called tolebrutinib were presented. And tolebrutinib showed You don't need to worry about the specifics here, but it basically showed that it could slow disease progressing in a cohort of people with non-relapsing secondary progressive multiple sclerosis. Now, the important part of this is that these people were non-relapsing. So we've seen some drugs that have been beneficial in people with secondary progressive MS before, but they all had relapses. And so the idea is they were probably still targeting that inflammatory component. This cohort didn't have relapses. And so this is the first evidence that we have of a drug that can target that neurodegeneration component. Now, this is massive. This was massive news at ECTRIMS last year that this trial was positive because, one, potentially now we have a therapy that can work in progressive MS, which is massive. But also this targets something that is causing disease progression in people with relapsing remitting MS as well, because we know this is happening from the very start. So the update on this is that very recently the Food and Drug Administration in the US, the FDA, has granted an accelerated review for tolobrutinib, understanding the importance of this. So we expect there to be an FDA decision on this, hopefully within the next few months. And the process tends to be that once the FDA approves, then we see approval throughout the rest of the world. Europe and Australia tend to follow closely on from that. So this was really big news in terms of the DMT space. So in terms of brain health, obviously being on an effective therapy and on a therapy that works for you is an important part of that. What all of these therapies are doing is trying to stop new damage from occurring. Now, as MS is damaging the insulation around those nerves, what happens when that insulation gets damaged, and shifting on to my next slide and what I can show here, if we just focus on the image here, this is obviously a healthy nerve here. So we can see this is the myelin sheath surrounding the nerve, and I'm sure you've all seen an image like this millions of times before. What happens in MS is that the immune system targets that myelin sheath, and so then that gets damaged. That then, in a state like you can see in the image, that slows the nerve signal from moving from one end of that nerve to the other. And so that's why there are the symptoms that get experienced in MS are experienced. It's because that nerve signal doesn't travel as well. However, what happens over time is here, we can see a slightly damaged part of myelin, but this will completely disappear. And that leaves the axon, the part underneath that you can see in little bits here, completely exposed. Once that is exposed, that can then essentially get deleted. And so it not only helps the nerves, the myelin sheath not only helps the nerve signal go quickly, but it also protects that nerve itself. And so what happens when that's exposed and then the nerve itself gets killed, that's one of the big things that can lead to that brain atrophy that we said at the start, is one of the key things that we're trying to avoid in terms of maximizing brain health. So one of the ways that we can do that is through therapies to try and stop new damage from occurring, to keep as many nerves as we can from looking healthy like this. However, what none of our existing therapies do is reverse the damage that's already there. And so this is the next big hope in terms of brain health, is that we are able to do myelin repair or remyelination. And so there are a number of groups around the world who are looking into remyelination. The one that is most progressed at the moment is a trial that's being done by the Cambridge Clinical MS Research Group, and they're looking at a combination of drugs called metformin, which was a diabetes drug, and clemastine, which was part of an antihistamine, both of which have shown potential to repair myelin in animal models of MS. So they're currently in a phase 2 trial at the moment, and we expect the results of that to be presented at ECTRIMS 2025, so in September this year. At MS Translate, we work really closely with the Cambridge group, and so you can actually follow along with their research, not just their remyelination trial, but other research they're doing on Facebook as well. If you type into Facebook Cambridge Clinical Multiple Sclerosis Research Group, you should find them. Again, I can send through links to that. But if you're interested in seeing updates on those trials, we're often over there filming videos with the team on that. You can hear about all of the other research that they're doing. But what I wanted to do quickly is just show and try and explain what's happening in that system and how they're measuring it. So I'm just going to stop sharing this, and I'm going to share through a little video that we've been producing that looks at that. So hopefully you can all see this video. I'm going to turn down my sound so that you can't hear all of the stuff going on behind it. But essentially what you're going to see here is on the left, we have the optic nerve of a healthy individual. On the right, we have the optic nerve of a person living with MS that has myelin damage in this optic nerve. And so one of the ways that they are testing the remyelination in this trial is to look at how quickly nerve signals travel from the eye to the back of the brain. And if you follow their page, we'll be releasing some videos on this soon. But just to show what this looks like, what you'll see as we press play here is that you can see that if that black dot is the nerve signal, the one on the left in the healthy individual travels much quicker than the one on the right. And that's because of that damage that's occurred to the optic nerve. Okay, and so you can see that that's happening like that. Now, if I stop that and zoom forward in the video, what we're then looking at here is this is then what they're looking at in the trial and what they're hoping to see. So on the left, you're going to see two dots, a green dot, or sorry, on both images, you're going to see a green dot. A green dot is what we would expect to see in a healthy individual. So you see that that dot moves quite quickly. In the left, we're looking at what happens if a person is on an effective remyelination therapy. So they've got some repair happened to that optic nerve. On the right, we'd have a participant that's on placebo. So if we just press play on this, focus on the left, you'll see that it's still slower, but that black dot is moving much quicker in the one who's got the myelin repair therapy compared to who's got placebo. And so that's what we're hoping to see in a trial like this, that by receiving this remyelination therapy, that it helps quicken up that process. Now, it may get to the same as the green dot. And so hopefully that explains a little bit in terms of how they're looking at in the trial and what we're hoping to see with that. Now, I can, yes, thank you. Sorry, I was just looking at the chat. Thank you for posting that. So that's remyelination. So that's going to be another therapy that hopefully would work in that setting. Now, beyond therapies, there are a number of other things that can be done. And I know these are all of interest to people living with MS because these are things that you have a bit more control over. But we know there are other things in terms of lifestyle modifications that can also impact on brain health. So they're here in terms of exercise, diet, smoking, mental health, cognition. I'm going to talk about each of these briefly. But before I talk about them, I want to bring up something that impacts on all of these things and impacts on the ability to actually action these lifestyle modifications. Because I think one of the things that definitely, I probably don't need to tell the audience here, but it's all well and good to say, you should exercise, you should eat well, you should do some brain training exercises. These things have barriers that can impact on being able to do them, and we need to be very mindful of the fact that barriers exist that stop people. And this is true for people living with MS. This is, true for the general population. I know I should exercise more than I do. One of the barriers for me is working longer hours, and so I run out of time to do that. So telling me that I should exercise more without taking thoughts on what those barriers aren't necessarily helpful. But one of the biggest barriers that we know impacts on all of these things in people living with MS is fatigue. Now, I want to talk about fatigue really quickly because I think handling fatigue, one, also impacts on brain health, but also helps you do a lot of the other activities that impact on brain health. And so I'm going to show a very similar graphic on the next slide. But before I do, I just want to really quickly talk about our shift in terms of talking about fatigue. So, you know, five plus years ago when I was attending MS conferences, we weren't really talking about fatigue. It just wasn't something that was hugely discussed. And I think the reason for that was, and, you know, I've heard this in conversations with many people living with MS, and, you know, you can agree with me in the chat if this is something that's happened to you in the past, is that often if a person living with MS said they had fatigue, said they were tired, the general response to that was, of course you are, you have MS. This is just something that goes with having MS. You have MS, you're fatigued. What we realize now, and part of this I think has come from people like yourselves who are engaged in research and active in this space and who have spoken up and said, this is something we want researched. This is something where we need to see a change because this impacts hugely on my daily life and my quality of life. And so there's been more research put into it. But so now there is an understanding that yes, MS fatigue is a thing. There is some fatigue that is just caused by the disease itself, but there are lots of other secondary causes of fatigue, and that's what I'm going to go through in a second. The other thing that we really understand from this is that conversation needs to get better. Healthcare professionals need to get better at listening to you around fatigue, understanding the right questions to ask, and then implementing a multidisciplinary team. There is lots of people who will come into this discussion. Neurologists, MS nurses, allied health professionals all need to be involved for a lot of these different things. But so if we look through contributors to fatigue, there are many. And if you look at some of these, you know, they align with other things that we talk about in terms of brain health. In the interests of time, I'm not going to go through each of these in any sort of detail. But, you know, there is, if we just focus on sleep as the best example and the one that's talked about the most at the moment. I love when I post a research summary to MS Translate about sleep being bad in people living with MS and this contributing to MS fatigue and getting the responses of, you know, duh, if we sleep worse, we're obviously going to be more tired. And yes, it seems straightforward, but it's actually been really important in the treatment of MS around identifying this as contributing separately to that primary MS fatigue that we talk about. So we know that people living with MS have worse sleep quality than people without MS. There are lots of reasons for that. Symptoms of MS can impact on sleep. So, you know, if bladder function or bowel function is implicated, you know, continence may get up more during the night to use the bathroom. This is going to contribute to worse sleep. If you've got spasticity in your legs or, you know, problems with pain in your legs, that's going to lead to worse sleep. People with MS are more likely to have insomnia. People with MS are more likely to have mental health conditions. All of these things contribute to worse sleep. And what's been shown is that, you know, worse sleep then contributes to fatigue, regardless of the MS fatigue. The important part of that and understanding that and people being aware of it is that that's something we can target. Sleep quality can be improved. If it's a mental health condition that's leading to bad sleep, you know, if it's depression, antidepressants may be helpful in that. You know, seeing a psychologist may be helpful in that. There are other things that can be done around sleep that may help in terms of fatigue. So it's really important that fatigue is a massive part of this conversation, because being able to do all of these things are going to be easier if the fatigue is lessened. So I just wanted to chat about that briefly. But so as we go through these just little bit by little bit, there isn't anything groundbreaking in terms of what research has shown, other than all of these things can be effective. So if we start with diet, for example, There is a lot of research that shows having a healthy, balanced diet is important for people living with MS for a number of reasons. One, there are studies that indicate that it may be able to be beneficial for disease progression. Having an overall healthy, balanced diet that's anti inflammatory can be beneficial. There's no evidence to necessarily suggest that any MS diet is better than any others, but having a good, healthy, balanced diet is useful, helps with brain health. There are then little studies that look at things like omega-3, omega-6, fish and seafood that may be rich in those things as being potentially beneficial. There are lots of little things that are being looked into, but the overall message on that is that diet is really important, especially because other things that can contribute to worse brain health are things like obesity. We know that people living with MS are at a greater risk of obesity, so a healthy, balanced diet can help with that. Similarly, we know that people living with MS are more likely to have comorbidities. Again, a healthy, balanced diet can help reduce some of those. In the same way, exercise has shown to be a really effective way of being able to maximize brain health. Importantly, with exercise, the conversation shifted to, and I think this is really important in terms of physical function, but also cognitive function. Prehabilitation is better than rehabilitation. So, in exactly the same way with any sort of physical function, it's the same with mental function. It's much easier to preserve it than to try and get it back after it's lost. And so using exercise from the start, having exercise as an inbuilt way as early as possible is really important. And I think an important note on exercise is that, there are a lot of it in the same way that we talk about fatigue. Fatigue is obviously a barrier to exercise. Exercise can actually is a really effective way of reducing fatigue in people living with MS. But there are other barriers to that. A lot of people may, for example, maybe in a wheelchair, and they may think, how am I going to exercise in a wheelchair? There are specific exercise programs that can be done for that. So exercise and implementing exercise in some fashion is really important. Smoking is a really big one. We know that smoking increases the risk of developing MS, but it also worsens progression. The positive note around that is we also know that stopping smoking at any time after an MS diagnosis will slow disease progression. So, if you were diagnosed with MS 15 years ago, you've kept smoking all the way through and think, well, I've been smoking up until now, what's the point of quitting? Quitting at any time does have benefits. So smoking is another big one there that can help preserve brain health, because the process of smoking increases inflammation. We saw inflammation being a big driver of those things that we showed at the start that can bring down brain volume, increase disease progression. Cognition and doing brain training exercises, cognitive behavioral therapy, all of these have been shown to also be effective. There are often a lot of small studies, and I think the big thing around a lot of this is we don't have anything super conclusive yet. We know that these things are beneficial, but understanding the best ways to do them, what's the best diet, what's the best exercise, what are the best ways in terms of brain training for cognition, these are things we don't necessarily understand definitively yet. But also mental health and getting on top of mental health. And I'm not, in the interest of time, not going to talk for ages about it, but I think we need to spend way more time talking about mental health in people living with MS. We know that people living with MS have greater rates of depression, greater rates of anxiety, greater rates of suicide. So, it's a really important topic that I don't think we talk about anywhere near enough, but it can be addressed through a number of different ways, both pharmacological in terms of treatment options for some of those conditions, but also through things like seeing a psychologist, working out plans for reducing stress and things like that. So I think Nicola talked about leaving with positive messages. I think, and I've only got one or two slides after this, but this is sort of the main end point of talking about brain health. I think the positive message around all of this is, from the first part, we have therapies that can work, and we're coming up with new therapies, and we're really, really hopeful that we will have myelin repair therapies in the near future. So from a treatment point of view, we're in a really good place. The other positive is there are a lot of things that people living with MS can be doing on a daily basis that can also help manage the disease and help slow some of these processes down. But having an understanding that these things require support, and so being willing to have the conversations and ask for support when it's needed, ask questions about how's the best way to do it, what should I be doing, it is really important. Conversation is a massive thing that I will always promote. So the last thing that I want to just talk about, just to make you aware, as Nicholas said at the start, I'm now heavily involved in the big MS research conference that happens every year called ECTRIMS. So this is a conference that happens in Europe, usually around September, where around 10,000 people who are neurologists, researchers, industry, allied health professionals come together to discuss the latest in MS research. And over the past 3 years, at the end of the conference, a new initiative has been put into place where we talk to people living with MS about the research that was discussed at the conference. Last year, for the first time, I was involved in that conference, so I hosted and moderated that event. And we completely changed the format, which seemed to resonate really well with people living with MS to make it much more engaging and more of a discussion. I am going to, again, be heavily involved this year, sort of running a lot of what's going on. But so you know, that event is going to be on the 26th of September. It's in Barcelona. If anyone would like to come to Barcelona and join us, that would be amazing. Obviously, that's not particularly easy, but if you do end up in Barcelona for the event, definitely come up and say hi. But it is live streamed online. Due to time differences, it tends to not be great for our part of the world, but it is all recorded. And so you'll be able to watch it back. This year, for the first time, we have a specific website for this event, which is at ectrimspatientcommunity.eu. You can access it. A lot of the information will be coming up soon in terms of the program, the topics we're going to be talking about, who will be on the panel, and who our supporting partners will be. And hopefully there's some exciting news around that from supporting partners from over this part of the world. So that then ends from me in terms of presentation. Happy to take questions on anything I've said or anything else that you've heard about MS research that you want me to talk about. But definitely please do connect with MS Translate on platforms, and you can then ask me questions through there at any later date if you have them. Thanks for listening.
Thanks so much, Brett. That was really informative. It was a great talk. Luminita.
Yeah, we have a question and improving cognition. If you can, our members quite often ask, what is the best way to, to keep the brain alert, and besides diet and exercise.
Yeah, so I think it's probably one of the ones where we've got little bits and pieces of research. We probably don't have definitive and conclusive answers on it yet. And I think my gut feel with a lot of lifestyle modifications with cognition is that it's going to be really similar to things like treatments, where it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. You're going to need to find the ways that work for each individual. But certainly things like brain training have been shown to have some positive effects on that. I think staying active and engaged, there's definitely things that show staying in employment can be beneficial for things like cognition. Now, that's obviously not always that easy, and so that's why there's a focus on a lot of these other things and finding strategies where a person can stay employed. But that definitely works, and staying, I think, socially connected as well is another way that can really help with that. We know that people who have strong social connections and support networks tend to have better outcomes than those that are isolated. So it's definitely things that, there's no magic pill for cognition. None of our existing therapies really have shown, and I mean, it's not something that's been hugely looked into, but none of them seem to necessarily target that directly, though by maintaining brain health for longer, that is going to have an indirect benefit to cognition.
Thank you so much, Brett. We had another interesting question. How do you know when to start the treatment for MS?
It's a good question, and I think probably an important time to say I'm obviously not a clinician, so I don't have a clinical background at all. My background is purely research. Certainly what the research has shown is that the earlier a person can get on an effective therapy, the better it is. That's what we know. So, there are obviously other factors that can come into that. So I think we need to, be really mindful of the fact that MS is a disease that primarily affects women, and it primarily affects people between the ages of 21 and 40. Now, there are going to be some people around that time who might want to start a family. And so, having conversations around family planning and what treatment is the most effective for that. And we have lots of research now showing what treatments can be used during that stage when they need to be stopped, so that the person living with MS is the most protected. But yeah, generally I'd say, the earlier a person can get on a therapy, the better. But those are conversations, at diagnosis and early in diagnosis to be having with your neurologist, your MS nurse, the team around you is really important during that.
Very interesting. Thank you for that. We have a question about the new drug, the tolebrutinib, that's applicable to secondary progressive. Can you talk a little bit about it, or maybe send us a link where people can actually look and get more information about it?
Yeah, so I mean, we're expecting the trial results to be published soon. So the trial results haven't yet been published. Once those trial results are out, we're expecting to have an ECTRIMS podcast episode talking about it. So that will be something that people can tune into. Understanding, though, that those podcasts aren't necessarily for this audience. They tend to be a bit more technical. Usually on MS Translate, we'll post a link and then there's a place for people to ask questions. It's a completely new class of therapies. So it's to give you the full name of these therapies, they're called Bruton's tyrosine kinase inhibitors, or BTKIs. So they're different in terms of how they work to any other therapies that we currently have. They basically stop an enzyme from working. Enzymes are things in the body that help chemical reactions to occur. It stops that. So the interesting thing around it is that there was also a trial for relapsing remitting MS that was also presented. So the same drug in a relapsing remitting cohort. That was also presented at ECTRIMS, and that trial failed. Now, our gut feel for that is that it failed because they were looking at a different outcome measure. Because based on all of the things that we know about what's happening, that should still have some impact in people with relapsing remitting MS. So that trial, even though it failed, often when trials failed, people go, okay, this drug doesn't work, we're going to stop looking at this. They're going to keep looking at that and do more analysis to see on a lot of these other measures that they looked at, was it positive? So it's really exciting in terms of what it's going to mean. I think it'll be interesting to see what the FDA review and approval is, whether they will also give some approval for primary progressive MS. It should work in that cohort as well, but they may require a trial on it before they will do that. But yeah, exciting stuff. But there's not a lot to link to at the moment other than the press release that Sanofi put out when they first announced the results.
Oh, thank you for that. Really interesting indeed. One of the listeners tonight noticed that you haven't discussed about HSCT and brain volume loss. And he says that is potentially the best treatment to maintain or normalize your brain health. Can you expand on this?
Yeah, so AHSCT, let me give a 60-second summary of what it is for people who may not know. Do I have to do the acronym? Autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplantation is basically, it's not a new therapy in terms of how it works. It's not even hugely a new therapy in terms of MS. Basically, what it does is that you will get stem cells taken out of your body. Traditionally, it would have been from bone marrow. There are now newer ways, less invasive ways to do that. Chemotherapy to wipe out your existing immune system. If we have this understanding that it's the immune system that's attacking and causing the damage in MS, and then putting in your stem cells to essentially reboot your immune system, with the idea here being that you're rebooting the immune system at an earlier stage before it had been triggered to attack your nerves. So that's sort of the principle behind how this treatment works. And yes, it can be a highly effective therapy in some people living with MS. We tend to think, and there was actually a recent ECTRIMS podcast episode on this that included Jennifer Massey, who I'm pretty sure has been over to Auckland for a research day and might have actually been at the research day I talked at in Auckland. She's based in Sydney, but she was on that podcast episode. We tend to think it is most effective in people relatively early in their disease course who have really highly inflammatory disease, active disease, and have failed a couple of therapies. But in some people, we've been able to see that when they get this therapy, they have then no evidence of disease activity for, 8-10 years off a single therapy. And I think one of the interesting ways that Jennifer put it in the podcast is we're front loading the risk in this treatment. So the treatment itself is obviously quite intense. There are a lot of risks with infection and stuff that can happen directly after the procedure, because you essentially have a period where you've got a very compromised immune system. But because it's a single treatment, then, once you get through that, you're not dealing with any of the other side effects, but the benefits remain. So yeah, it's a very valid point in terms of it's one of the treatment approaches that we do have that could be used. It seems that it's still largely going to be used as a backup to people who have failed other therapies, but whether that changes over time, we wait and see.
That's really interesting. Yeah. There is another question in remyelination. If there's any successes, recent methods that prove that is possible.
So we know it's possible. So one of the best ways that we know that this can work in people living with MS is the Cambridge group, who are currently doing the metformin clemistine trial, which is called CCMR2, did a trial before that called CCMR1. Very novel in terms of how they name these things. But that trial used another drug called bexarotene. And the trial had to be stopped because the side effects that people had were really bad. Essentially, they all were dealing with thyroid complications. And so the trial was stopped. But doing analysis of the trial, they did see that remyelination was successful in some of these people, and they actually learnt a lot, because it was when they looked throughout the brain, one of the phrases that they used was that remyelination, it wasn't equal. Certain parts of the brain repaired better than other parts of the brain, and so they've learned a bit about this. And we have another video talking about that coming out with Cambridge soon, where they talk about using MRI and what they learnt from that. But that was really big, because it showed in people living with MS that we can repair myelin. It's just that drug wasn't going to be an effective way of doing that because of the side effects. So we know it's possible. We have lots of others other than that trial that's going on. There are lots of other groups looking into lots of other different avenues and compounds that have shown success at various stages, mostly in terms of preclinical, so cells in a lab or animal models, or very, very early stage trials, but nothing. The Cambridge trial is the furthest along at the moment. But when we talk to people working in that field, they all say that it's a matter of when, not if. That this is not, it is not a question for the experts working on this. It's not a question of is this possible. It's just a matter of when will it happen. And they're all relatively confident that within the next 5 years we will hopefully see something. So I maintain that optimism. They're the experts. So yeah, it's possible. We just need to find the right way of doing it.
That's fabulous indeed. Yeah. And another question is, do we have much data on lifestyle changes versus DMT, or the combination of both? Again, in terms of remyelination.
Oh, in terms of remyelination, well, no, not really, but yes. Is that a good answer? Not really, but yes. What we can say with that Cambridge trial, I keep coming back to the Cambridge trial as sort of the big one that we're looking at the moment. The reason why they started looking at metformin in the first place is that they had done a study before that looking at intermittent fasting. And so one of the problems that we know that stops myelin repair in MS is aging, and not aging in terms of chronological age, but biological age. And the biological age doesn't necessarily align with chronological age. Let me explain that. I'm 21. No, I'm not, but let's just say that I'm 21. But, that's my chronological age, but my biological age could be well advanced of that or well below that, depending on, how I've looked after myself. We know that the biological age in people living with MS may be different to the chronological age, and they may age slightly quicker. And it's the aging of some cells that are involved in the myelin repair process that is a problem. So we know that once those cells get older, they're much worse at repairing myelin damage. We know that because if you look at children with MS, they are much, much better at repairing myelin damage than adults living with MS, as well as a bunch of other studies. One of the best ways that we know about in terms of slowing biological aging is intermittent fasting. And so that's why they first started looking at this. And so they did a study in mice where they had mice who were essentially given MS. Some of those mice ate every second day. So they had a day without eating, then they would eat. And then they had other mice that just ate whenever they wanted to. They found that those mice that had the intermittent fasting repaired their myelin damage much better than the ones who were eating normally. Understanding that intermittent fasting isn't necessarily going to be easy for a group of people who are already living with fatigue, have energy production problems. They wanted to look at what's another way that we might be able to do this. And metformin, being a diabetes drug, it mimics fasting. So they did that same study, they did that same study using metformin and found the same thing. The mice that took the metformin, as opposed to those who didn't receive any drug, were much better at repairing myelin. So in terms of can lifestyle have an impact, intermittent fasting, at least in mice, was a way that we've seen myelin repair is happening. But beyond that, no, there hasn't been anything big in terms of looking at lifestyle versus drugs in that space.
That's very interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah. And I think this is the end of our questions.
There you go. Perfect timing.
Yes.
That is perfect timing. It's 8 o'clock exactly. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who's joined tonight. Thank you so much to you, Brett, and to MS Translate for giving us so much information.